One of the things you talked about was how arguments that were on the margins have shifted, at least to the mainstream, to be debated. They're now debatable.
Correct.
They're engageable.
And they no longer can be shot down with you're an anti-Semite.
Right.
Those days are over.
You made an argument recently that turned some heads, to be sure. You said that Hamas's October 7th attack was comparable in some ways to Nat Turner's slave revolt, a rebellion of enslaved Black Americans in Virginia that took place in 1831. You've also referred to Gaza frequently as a concentration camp. Those types of historical comparisons probably aren't in the mainstream yet. In fact, they offend some people, they outrage some people. Why do you make them?
Well, the primary reason I make them is because I think they're true. Now, the Nat Turner Rebellion was replete with the most horrifying atrocities. The order Nat Turner, for those of you who don't know, because I don't know what your audience is, the United States had not a lot, but it had slave rebellions before the Civil War. And the best known one and the most famous one was the Nat Turner Rebellion. They killed about 60 people in the Nat Turner Rebellion. The order given by Nat Turner, according to the historians, the order was very straightforward. Kill all whites. That was the order. Kill all whites. And they proceeded to do just that. So when I read that, a light went on in my head, and I said, okay, now I have something roughly analogous to October 7th. So now my next challenge is, okay, so how do you render a judgment on the Nat Turner Rebellion? So I figured I would go to the people who were, so to speak, closest to me in my political trajectory, which would be the abolitionists, those who were fighting for the end of slavery. However, they were very strictly against the use of violence. And so I was curious, okay, how did they assess the Nat Turner Rebellion? And so I turned to William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the most famous of the abolitionists. He edited the newspaper called The Liberator. And it's very worth reading it, what he said. He began by saying, "We told you so," because he was speaking to white people. "We told you so. We told you, if you keep treating people this way, if you treat them this way, it's going to be a reaction." And he went on to say that, of course, atrocities, or I think he called it horrors, occurred during the Nat Turner Rebellion. But if you read the statement from start to finish, he never condemned Nat Turner. He does not. It's, you know, it was for me an epiphanal moment, because I spent the last 15 or more years of my life chronicling the horrors in Gaza. The fact that those folks who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th had been born into a concentration camp. Not only were they born into it, but they were living in it, and they were destined to die in it. And that was Nat Turner.
But is this an explanation from a dispassionate scholar who's simply saying, look how inevitable this violence on October 7th was? Or is it an endorsement of the action by saying, look, they had no choice. This is literally the only legitimate and morally acceptable option they could make?
Look, when you pass moral judgments, in my opinion, you have to offer options. What else could they have done? So, when Hamas was elected in 2006...
Well, you've just talked about the international courts, right? So, and you have a growing optimism.
Yeah.
Does that stuff only happen because of the armed resistance? In other words, would we have the world's attention? Would there be...
I'm going to say what the facts tell me. Now, I'm not saying I'm the only person in possession of the facts, but the facts as they tell me. In 2006, when Hamas was elected, it was elected on a reform platform. because the Palestinian Authority is so corrupt, people wanted a change.
Yeah.
If you study, immediately as they were elected, the international community, first Israel, then the US, then the EU, imposed this brutal economic blockade on Gaza. Now, if you study the record, Hamas was attempting a diplomatic solution to the conflict. It talked about recognizing Israel, two states, having a long-term ceasefire. It made many options. All of it was rebuffed. All of it was rejected. Then, in March 2018, they attempted the Great March of Return, a nonviolent civil resistance. What happened? Well, we know exactly what happened. A UN investigative body produced a report. It was 250 single-spaced pages. According to the report, Israel deliberately targeted children. Israel deliberately targeted medics. Israel deliberately targeted journalists. And here's the best one of all. Israel deliberately targeted disabled people. Okay? And they have the descriptions in the report. A person in the distance, on crutches, 300 meters from the perimeter fence, shot in the head. A person in a wheelchair, 200 meters, shot down. So, of course, the nonviolence is going to fail. If people are just being shot down like, swatted down like flies, and there's no international reaction, it can't work. The whole premise of nonviolent civil resistance is that if you're willing to incur the suffering, then the international community, or in the case of our own country during the civil rights movement, the North and the federal government will be moved by the violence, moved in sympathy to act. When you show the violence, you remember the whole point of nonviolence as Martin Luther King understood it. If you read, for example, the letter from the Birmingham jail, he says that violence is embedded in the system. And all we're doing is we're bringing it to the surface.
They're dramatizing it and putting a spectacle on it.
Exactly, in order to evoke sympathy.
But does it work if everyone's white? The reason
that's what I'm going to say.
Oh.
You answered, that's the point. It didn't work in Gaza. It didn't work. So now you're at the heart of the dilemma. If diplomacy didn't work, they tried. I'm not saying what they were saying was perfect. I'm not saying it wouldn't have required, intense negotiations to make it work. But there were steps taken by Hamas. That didn't work. Nonviolent civil resistance didn't work. And by the time you got to October 6th, it was clear that a deal was going to be made with the Saudis. And then the whole conflict between Israel and the Arab world would have been resolved above the heads of the people of Gaza. And the only thing those 2 million people would have to look forward to is to languish and die in that concentration camp. So
your critics, though, would say there was at least an opportunity for hope or possibility. Now there's almost 33,000 people dead, 8,000 into the rubble, schools destroyed, almost entire built environment destroyed.
I'm not going to defend that. I'm not going to even defend the action.
But I guess I mean is ultimately, was it a successful plan?
I think that politics is a very unpredictable business. So let me give you the analogy, and then you can answer me. Yeah. When Nat Turner carries out his rebellion, the immediate reaction was the whites in the South went on a lunatic rampage. They randomly killed about 120 black people just, off the street. As you can imagine what happened. Yeah. And then another 80 were killed, died after being convicted in court. So about 200 black people were killed. That was the first consequence. So many a person like yourself would say, was it worth it? 61 white people were killed and now 200 of us were killed. Was it worth it? What was the second thing that happened? The law changed. After Nat Turner, they passed the law, black people can't learn how to read. because Nat Turner was very literate. I said he knew the Bible and he was very smart. So they prohibited teaching a black person to read. Third thing that happened, they prohibited black people from congregating together, okay? Because the people thought he was giving sermons to the black people, and instead it turned out they were plotting the rebellion, okay? So someone like you would say, did that make any sense? Was it worth it?
Right.
200 black people were killed, or 30,000 Gazans were killed. The law is now more repressive than ever, okay? So there's an argument there. But then along comes John Brown. And when you read John Brown, he says, I was inspired by Nat Turner, okay? So then you could say, well, John Brown, what did he accomplish? His uprising was put down in about a couple of days. He was executed, okay? But then along comes Frederick Douglass, and he delivers his famous speech on John Brown, one of his best, in my opinion. And he says, he goes through all the arguments. John Brown was a failure for this reason. John Brown was a failure for that reason. John Brown was a failure for this reason. And John Brown, Nat Turner was a religious fanatic, so was John Brown. John Brown was just like Nat Turner. He was convinced he was a vessel of God and slavery was an abomination, which it was, but most people didn't believe it was that degree of abomination that you're going to give your life for it, okay? So along comes Frederick Douglass, and he says, there's a straight arrow line from John Brown to the Civil War. Nat Turner, John Brown, Civil War. Now, I know I leave out a lot of other factors, but it was a way station to the Civil War. And now Nat Turner occupies an honored place in American history. So I say, I know people won't like it when I say it, but I think it's a question mark how October 7th is going to be regarded in the future. If Nat Turner now occupies an honored place, I think it's a question mark.